You found out about the inheritance and the first thing you felt wasn't grief, it was math. The number arrived in your head before the funeral was over, and you felt guilty about that, and then you pushed it down and then it came back. Because the number was real and for the first time in a long time, so was the possibility that something in your financial life might actually change. That feeling, that specific, complicated hope, is exactly where this begins. Because there is a pattern so consistent, so thoroughly documented, so quietly devastating that researchers have a name for it. Sudden wealth syndrome, the psychological unraveling that happens when a person who has spent years managing scarcity is suddenly handed abundance. And the inheritance, the $200,000, the $350,000, the $500,000, whatever the number is, becomes the most expensive thing that ever happened to them. Not because they were foolish, not because they were irresponsible. Because nobody told them what was coming, nobody prepared them for the specific ways that a large sum of money, arriving without a framework, without experience, without a plan, will find its way out of your life faster than it found its way in. And by the time you realize it's happening, most of it is already gone. Let's start where most people start. The number lands in your account, and for the first week, you don't touch it. You just look at it. You've never seen that many digits with your name attached to them. It feels unreal, it feels like a mistake. And underneath the unreality is this quiet, urgent pressure, a voice that's been waiting for years to say the things it couldn't say when you were managing month to month. The car, the house, the debt, the thing you've wanted for so long you stopped admitting you wanted it. The money arrives and every deferred desire arrives with it. And you tell yourself you'll be smart about it. You tell yourself this is different. You've seen people blow money. You're not that person. You're going to think this through. You're going to be strategic. You're going to honor what this money cost because it costs someone everything, and you know that, and the weight of that is real. But here's what happens in the first 90 days that nobody prepares you for. The first category of loss is the visible one, the decisions you make consciously, deliberately, with what feels like good reason. You pay off the car, that makes sense. You were paying 6% interest and the payment was eating your monthly cash flow. Done. You pay off the credit cards, obviously, high-rate debt gone. That's responsible, that's what the money is for. And then someone in your family, a parent, a sibling, a spouse, has a need, not a want, a need. Medical bills or a business that's struggling or a situation that is genuinely difficult to say no to when you were suddenly the person in the room with resources. And you help because you can, because not helping would feel like a betrayal of what the money is supposed to mean. And then you make one purchase, not extravagant, just meaningful. The thing you've waited years for, you deserve it. The person who left you this money would want you to have something that matters to you, and all of that is true. And you've now spent 40% of the inheritance in 90 days on things that were, every single one of them, defensible. And this is where it gets interesting, because the second category of loss is invisible. It happens in the background of the first 90 days and it continues after. It's the lifestyle adjustment, small at first. You stop tracking spending the way you used to because there's a cushion now and the anxiety of monitoring every dollar loosens its grip and you breathe differently around money for the first time in years, and that breathing differently costs you, quietly, every single month. The restaurants that were occasional become regular. The version of things you used to buy gets upgraded, not dramatically, just slightly, across the board, in 100 small ways that together shift your monthly burn rate up by $600, $800, $1,200 a month. And that shift feels sustainable because the account is still substantial until it isn't. The average inheritance in the United States is consumed within 3 years. Not squandered on one catastrophic decision, dissolved across hundreds of decisions, each reasonable in isolation, together amounting to the erasure of generational wealth that took decades to accumulate and years to transfer and months to disappear. 3 years, and what happens next is the part most people miss. There's a woman named Renata She received $380,000 when her mother died. She was 41, had a stable job, 2 kids, a mortgage she'd been managing carefully for 8 years. She was not irresponsible. She was, by every reasonable measure, a thoughtful person who had made difficult money work for a long time. She paid off the car, paid off the cards, gave her brother $30,000 to help with his situation because it was the right thing to do. Bought a better used car because the one she had was genuinely unreliable and she needed transportation. Took the family on a trip her mother would have loved. One trip, not extravagant. $9,000. Put $50,000 in a savings account and told herself that was the foundation she'd build from. 18 months later, the savings account had $22,000, not because of one mistake. Because the mortgage felt more payable, so she stopped the anxious overpayments she'd been making and spent that margin differently. Because the slightly better car had slightly higher insurance. Because the trip established a family rhythm of experiences that felt important to maintain. Because her brother needed a little more, once and then once more. Because the home needed a repair that the savings absorbed. Because her lifestyle, adjusted upward by the feeling of having had resources, did not fully readjust downward when the resources began to thin. At 43, Renata had less net worth than she'd had at 40, not from grief, not from recklessness. From the absence of a framework that could hold the money long enough for it to become something. But there's something darker underneath this. Because Renata's story is not about what she did wrong, it's about what she was never taught. Nobody sat her down before the money arrived and said, here is how sudden wealth actually moves through a life. Here is the psychology of it. Here is why the decisions that feel right in the first 6 months are often the most expensive ones. Here is the one rule that separates the people who transform an inheritance into lasting change and the people who return 2 or 3 years later to approximately where they were before, except now carrying the additional weight of having had it and lost it. Nobody taught her this. You were too busy surviving to see the pattern. And the financial system, the advisors who appear when large sums of money surface, the family members with opinions, the products suddenly available to you, is not designed to preserve your inheritance. It's designed to interact with it, and interaction, without your own clear framework, is how the money moves from your account to somewhere else. Here's what nobody tells you about money. The people who hold inherited wealth, who actually transform it into something that compounds, something that changes the trajectory of their family, don't do it by making better individual decisions than you. They do it by having a structure in place before the money arrives that is stronger than the emotional and social pressure that arrives with it. And that structure is not complicated, but it requires something most people in the middle of grief and relief and hope and guilt are not positioned to build from scratch. It requires distance. It requires a framework that precedes the feeling. It requires understanding that the money is not yours to spend, it is yours to deploy. And deployment is a completely different relationship with a large sum than spending is. The wealthy don't think about inheritance the way you were taught to think about it. They don't think of it as a windfall, they think of it as capital. Capital doesn't get consumed, capital gets positioned. It goes into assets that produce more capital. And the people who were handed that framework, by parents who modeled it, by advisors who explained it before the need arose, by their own financial education, they hold the money. The people who weren't handed that framework spend the first year doing reasonable things that cumulatively drain the account, and by the time they realize what's happening, the leverage is gone. That framework, that's what this is about. Here's the first principle. The 90-day rule is not optional. It is the difference between transformation and transaction. The common belief is that some decisions are obvious and should be made immediately. Pay off the high-rate debt. Handle the urgent thing, get the house in order. And emotionally, this feels like responsibility, like stewardship, like honoring the money by putting it to immediate productive use. But here's what that belief costs you. It deploys capital before you have a complete picture. It makes permanent decisions from a temporary emotional state, grief, relief, pressure, urgency, that will not look the same in 6 months. And once the money is spent, the decision is made. You cannot unspend the $40,000 that went to the right cuz at the wrong time. You cannot recover the $25,000 that went to the family situation that, in retrospect, did not require that much. The people who hold inherited wealth put everything in a high-yield account for 90 days and make no major financial decisions. Not because the obvious decisions aren't real, because making them from a state of acute emotional activation without a full plan for the whole sum is how 40% disappears in the first quarter. The 90 days creates the distance between stimulus and response. And in that gap, that deliberate, uncomfortable pause, the right architecture for the money can actually be built. The identity shift is from I have money to handle things to I am the steward of capital that needs a structure before it needs a use. That is a different person. That person does not feel the same relief in the first month because the relief of action has been replaced by the discipline of waiting. But that person still has the money in year 3. And what happens next is the part most people miss. Here's the second principle. The family pressure problem is not about generosity. It's about boundaries that were never established. This is the one nobody wants to talk about, but it's the one that accounts for more inheritance dissolution than almost any other single factor. When money arrives, relationships restructure around it. People who love you genuinely, not maliciously, reposition themselves relative to your new resources, the sibling with the struggling business, the parent with the medical bill, the cousin with the opportunity that just needs a small investment to get started, the friend who has never asked for anything but this one time. Each request is legitimate enough to be difficult to refuse. Each one is backed by real relationship, real history, real affection. And each one, when handled without a pre-established framework, is a negotiation that you are structurally unprepared to win. Because when you say yes to the first family request, you have established that the money is available for family needs. And that precedent, once set, is almost impossible to walk back without damaging relationships you care about. The money becomes a shared resource in the minds of people who didn't earn it and aren't managing it, and the erosion is social before it's financial. The people who hold inherited wealth establish the framework before the requests arrive. They decide in advance in writing, in their own mind before any conversation, what percentage of the inheritance, if any, is available for family support. That number is fixed. It is not negotiable because the situation is compelling. It is set when the emotional temperature is low and it holds when the temperature is high. And every request that comes in gets measured against the framework, not against the feeling of the moment. This sounds cold. It is not cold. It is the difference between being generous intentionally and being drained accidentally. Real generosity comes from a position of stability. Accidental generosity from a sudden influx of wealth produces resentment on one side and dependency on the other, and neither of those outcomes honors the money or the people involved. This is where it gets interesting. Here's the third principle. The first year of an inheritance is a test of identity, not a test of financial knowledge. This is the deeper thing, the reason the 90-day rule is hard. The reason the family boundary is hard. The reason people who are not irresponsible, not unintelligent, not careless, still lose the money. The reason is that a large sum of money creates an identity pressure that most people have never experienced and have no framework for navigating. When you have money, other people treat you differently, subtly, mostly, but differently. And that different treatment begins to reshape how you see yourself. You start making choices that match the image of a person with resources because the money has upgraded your social position, at least temporarily, and there is deep human pressure to maintain the position you've been placed in. The slightly better restaurant, the hosting you do because now you can. The gift that's more generous than you would have given before. The version of yourself that you've always imagined but couldn't afford. And every one of those expressions of the new identity costs money that should be compounding instead. The people who transform inherited wealth are the ones who maintain their pre-inheritance identity long enough for the money to establish itself in assets. They don't become the person with money, they become the person who has assets. Those are not the same person. The person with money spends from it. The person who has assets doesn't touch the principle. The upgrade in identity they allow is not lifestyle, it's security, it's optionality. It's the quiet knowledge that the number is there and growing and will not be gone in 3 years because they held the line between who they were and who the money invited them to become. That line is the hardest thing to hold, and it is the only thing that matters. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The inheritance was the single largest financial event of your life, or will be. And the 3-year window, the window where the pattern plays out, where the money finds its way back to the economy, where the transformation either happens or doesn't, is already running. For some people, it started when the number appeared. For others, it started when they started rationalizing the first decision. The clock doesn't care about the intention, it just marks the time. Projected forward, the $400,000 that compounded for 20 years and touched is $1.8 million. That is the college fund, the retirement, the thing you pass to your children that they don't immediately dissolve because you modeled for them what holding looks like. The $400,000 that was gone in 30 months is a memory, a period of your life when things felt different for a while, some good decisions made, some help given, and then back to where you were, except now carrying the knowledge of what it felt like to have had it. 5 years from now, you will either have the asset base that the inheritance made possible, or you will have a set of reasonable explanations for why the money went where it went. Both are real, both will feel true. Only one of them changes the trajectory, so here's where you are. 2 paths, and neither one is the one you imagined when the number first appeared. The first path is the one most people take. You handle things as they come. You respond to the obvious, the urgent, the relational, the emotional. You make the decisions that feel right in the moment because the moment is all you have, and the moment keeps arriving with new pressures and new needs, and before long the account is at a number that is still more than you had before, but less than what it was and declining. And the lifestyle that adjusted upward hasn't fully adjusted back, and the trajectory is clearer than you want it to be. The second path requires you to do the hardest thing a person can do with sudden money. Wait. Build the framework before the first major decision. Define what the money is for, not vaguely, not emotionally, but specifically and in writing, before the first request arrives. Establish the identity of the person who holds this money rather than the person who received it. And hold that identity against every social, emotional, and relational pressure that will test it in the first year. That path doesn't feel like the right thing to do in the first month. It feels like restraint when you want to act, like distance when you want to connect, like discipline when you want relief. But it's the only path where the money still exists in 3 years. What did you want the inheritance to change? Hold that answer, really hold it. Because right now, the money is asking you the same question.